I'm Rowan Bailey and I am the curator of the exhibition Thought Positions in Sculpture, funded by ROTOR, which took place at Huddersfield Art Gallery in October 2015 and ran until January 2016. I wanted to consider the ways in which artists as creative practitioners might work with archival material in a sculptural way, the ways in which they might engage with archives of well-renowned sculptors, and to try to consider that in the context of artistic research. So I tasked the artists involved in the exhibition with a series of archival resources that they could go and explore in their own way. And also I left the door open for the artists to think about their own approach to the archive, where they wanted to generate their own archival strategies as part of this thought process. So I wasn't particularly interested in the resources themselves. They are just kind of sources of kind of knowledge and information about lots of different ways of thinking about artistic processes. What I was very interested was the possibility of the contemporary artists in the show staging their own thought positions and how they were actually kind of going to articulate that through the writing of their responses to this kind of process. And as part of a series of events, we kind of generated an online website where every 2 weeks, each artist would post their kind of written narrative where they were actually writing through the process of involvement in this exhibition. And what's really interesting about that process is that there are lots of different artist voices and perspectives being staged and articulated in the context of this exhibition. So whilst the exhibition itself contained all of these different works on display, and that was part of a kind of a necessary kind of curatorial strategy, it was also an open door to allow something kind of to evolve throughout the process of the 3-month opening of the exhibition. So the ideas have taken shape in the aftermath of the exhibition opening. They've continued to grow, and each of the artists involved in the show, their own thought positions have obviously moved into different contexts and changed shape and form. And perhaps that's what we need to kind of try to get to grips with when we start to think about what does it mean to stage a thought position, particularly in the context of an exhibition. But how do we think through that as a kind of a narrative process?
The work we showed in the Thought Positions in Sculpture exhibition was a kind of aspect of our long-term project, which was called Shadow Worlds Writers' Rooms. And that particular piece originated from a study of the Freud Museum in London. The piece we showed at Huddersfield Art Gallery was essentially the film as a single screen piece, and the Alisant chair, Freud's anthropomorphic chair, and sat the chair opposite the film as if Freud might potentially sit in that space, or anyone can sit in that space and watch the film. I think partly because we wondered how Freud might have felt actually watching the film.
Everything was captured by recording the space in some way, so either the creaking of the stairs or the closing of a cupboard or the kind of opening of a drawer or the pulling of the curtains, these sorts of things to generate a soundscape that kind of accompanied this action of the figures throughout the stairwells and throughout the space. There was a landing on the stairs that was known to be occupied by the women of the Freud household. So, obviously you got Freud, this great father figure, the father of psychoanalysis and the father of that household, but there was this particular space that the women kind of had as their space. The interesting thing about the Freud Museum itself is that the archive is the museum. There isn't an archive that they have stored away somewhere, it's all out pretty much. So the study is the museum. We'd already worked with a replica of Freud's chair when we were down in the museum. So all the filming that we've done with the chair was actually not with his real chair, it was with the replica chair. So we asked permission to actually borrow that chair, which is part of the collection of the Freud Museum. So there was this sort of double of his original chair. But we also discovered that there's more than one double as well. So there's actually a double in Vienna, and also a double that was made for a David Cronenberg film as well, about Freud and Jung. So it has quite an interesting story, the chair and the replication, and the fact that the chair itself is very anthropomorphic. And also it was made especially for Freud, wasn't it, as well, because of the way that he liked to sit to read. So in a way it stands in for Freud himself. Often we're temporarily in a space, so it is like a sojourn, it's like we're passing through. We don't really belong there, it sort of belongs to someone else, but we're interposing our sort of presence into that space for a particular time, and in a sense sort of occupying it, and evidencing that occupation in the work that we produce.
And
So
I think
a
that's
temporary thing.
because we like the idea of space being public. That's really important to us, especially I think as women, but for anybody, you know, and space increasingly is becoming quite private. So that's an interesting, I think, a subtle but undercurrent of our ongoing practice. How you can gain access to things, and somehow artists seem to be able to do that.
I decided that I wanted to try and do something that was about colour and about what I felt was that really nebulous gap between painting and sculpture. And so I have this pile of wood in the corner of the studio, and I just selected some lengths of wood and I'd chopped them into different shapes and painted them different colours to sort of vaguely represent what the collapse between painting and sculpture. And just by having these coloured sticks, I brought them along to this meeting and I said, this is my sculptural thought. And I held this bunch of sticks on the table and then let go like pickup sticks. And so they just fell in some sort of pictorial form. And I'd also written things about that sort of tried to articulate some of my questions. And they're very quick sort of notes that I read out to people. And I knew when I did that I'd done something really important. And I then went on a residency and I'd photographed myself in the studio dropping the sticks. So I have lots of different photographs of just, not so much the action of me dropping them, but I'd photographed them obviously after, just on my phone, just after those sticks had dropped. So there was these sort of random spacings and I thought these were really interesting. And then I went on a residency and I decided to make drawings from these photographs. They don't really look like the photographs very much. But I was working from the photographs, you know, copying to a degree, but playing with the colour. And I decided to go to the Leeds Art Gallery, the sculpture collection there. And then I saw Geoffrey Clark's piece and it was like my sticks had become alive and turned into something else. And I recognised it. I knew straight away that this was something that I just knew. I understood it. I understood the language that this was made in. And so it did happen in a sort of backwards way, but it doesn't seem to matter because I think he would have recognised what I had done. So there was this synergy I felt between our thoughts. So that's really how I ended up backwards in the show.
The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Actually, that's two pieces of sculpture and an essay wrapped into something that I could think about a very particular piece of music that became popular at a very particular time in my life. It's a highly theorised piece of music, and it sort of wrapped this memory I have of learning about, wanting to be a really good sculptor and learning from works that made me play an oppositional game in my mind about what was good and what was bad, and how could I bring that forward in the work that I wanted to make, which essentially wanted to be on the good side. So you've got these stories of this very influential but little known French woman artist, and it was important that she was a woman in that period because our history is full of male names on the whole. So Germaine Richier was not just distinct because she was a sculptor's favourite and some rare work in the Tate and French, but she was a woman. So she was making sculpture with a different sensibility. And the works of Reg Butler, who I wanted to admire, but his later works caused a lot of consternation socially. Women artists particularly demonstrated against them at the Tate, and he's known for publishing very male and genius orientated and class orientated views on good sculpture, and I'm really interested in the way these things run through my own mind when I'm making work, because I think they still perform in what I do, or my own determination to defy that kind of culture is still performing in what I do as teacher and artist. So that wrap of the three things, the important opportunity in the ROTOR project was in my opportunity to write out and write through an attempt to make sense of the way my mind is in play with my hands in the work when I'm making it. And those works that I was thinking about, I think because I'm making tiny works now, they are in the scale of, and they're modelled, they really are dancing around in my imagination. I want to do it as well as them, but I want the meaning to be different. So that work as a whole with the writing is a great opportunity to try and put that story into a kind of scholarly, informed context about sculpture, feminism, lived experience, cultural capital, all those things. And yet still be pertinent, personal, and it sits within those works as a group.
I came across this photograph of the Head of Victory, and it was a sculpture by an artist called Henry Charles Fair of the figure of Victory, made initially for the Leeds War Memorial, and it was unveiled in 1922. But all that remains is this head, the figure of Victory, that had to be taken off the War Memorial in the 1970s because it was becoming unstable due to the poor quality of the bronze, and ended up, I think, at some stage they just cut the head off and melted down the remains of the body. So that intrigued me, and I wanted to discover more about its history. I went to the Leeds Library, public records in the library, and they've got a whole book of press cuttings about what sort of memorial we should have for the city of Leeds. After that, I went to the West Yorkshire Archive Service, and they had a whole file of letters written by families of people who had died in the First World War. They were letters from people wanting to attend the ceremony and asking for tickets. So I explored the figure of victory on this war memorial in two different ways, really. One was I was thinking about how when you have this great loss, this great shared loss, all these people who died in the First World War, all these bereaved families, they need a point which they can come together. So the unveiling ceremony was obviously hugely important to a lot of people, but at the same time, as well as being a figure of grief and mourning, it was also a figure of victory that stood on the top of this war memorial. The figure still represented a triumph, and when you read the press cuttings, they are definitely looking for something that will represent the ideals of the British Empire. And so in order to investigate that, I was interested in partly the materiality of the sculpture itself and the fact that the head that's now left behind is kind of a decapitated head. That's all that's left. And you can see up into the neck. And this brought to mind my thoughts about the term hollow victory and the materiality of this head, which is now so corroded and sort of stained. And so I wanted to explore that idea of the ideal of empire and the reality of empire. I went down to the Imperial War Museum and I went into their film archive, and I found those amazing, so I wanted to use those in some way to show the other side of what this monument might represent. I decided to position the head of Victory quite high up because I wanted viewers to look up into her hollow neck. And then I'd found in the files at Leeds Art Gallery, there was a little piece of a kind of fragment of the base of the statue. So this tiny fragment I positioned in front of the head. And then on either side of her, to one side, I'd made these kind of drawings, collages that were made out of copies of these letters of families, and also copies of the press clippings that I'd seen in Leeds Library, and photographs and drawings that I'd made as well. So they're on one side, but then on the other side to think about the effects of conflict and also ongoing conflicts in the world, ongoing wars. I chose on that side to use some of this Imperial War Museum footage.
Kenneth Armitage was the sculptor that I chose to look at, and I was absolutely fascinated by some of the books that had been produced by Armitage when he was selling his work. These particular books were full of little mini sketches of his work that he had actually sold in the late 1950s. So you could see almost like a passage of these particular pieces going in and out of his studio. And as a constructed textiles person, what fascinated me was the method in which these were recorded. So the sort of notations were the first thing that took my sort of interest, I guess. So I hadn't really seen his pieces at this stage. These particular books were full of crossed lines, they were very structural. They reminded me of weave notation. So as a weaver, you actually work from a set of diagrams or peg plans which decide how the loom moves. And this reminded me of that. So it was quite a set of sequences that I felt I could follow or respond to. As I dug deeper into Armitage's work, I found reference to the actual maquettes that he'd made, and they were really delicate, they were surprising in their scale, and he works very much in working with linked figures, and the way in which these figures link together almost forms a skin across what would be a sort of basic armature underneath. So this skin reminded me of the properties of a cloth. So often in textiles you produce a fabric which you can't really see how it's made, it's being finished, it's being manipulated, it's hidden from sight what the real structure is. My work that I developed through my master's investigation was looking at a technique called lino weaving. And lino weaving allows you to create a very open and revealing structure. It allows threads to cross over each other, which is very unusual in weaving, and create something very stable and yet transparent and something you could manipulate. So I saw sort of reference both visually and structurally to what Armitage had created. Sort of parallel to my investigation at this early stage, I actually engaged in a sculpture course at the Hepworth in Wakefield. And this allowed me to actually engage in the process of making these maquettes. So I started to understand how the structures were formed, how the wire actually then was held together with very sort of open gauzes, very weave-like at this stage, before the sort of clay or the plaster was added on top of it. So he was working in sort of an additive way, and that really sort of resonated with the way in which I work. I work in a very additive way as a weaver. I have to start with a very strong structure. The warp that you put through the loom has to be rigid, it has to be, really cope with all the stresses of the process that you're going to put it through. So the pieces I created in the end were using this lino weaving technique. I worked with a range of fibres, so quite technical looking. It had properties that were more akin to perhaps sculpture or engineered pieces, so very strong monofilament, wire, paper was in there as well. And the final pieces actually created a triptych of 3 interlinked figures, very sort of reminiscent of what I'd seen in Armitage's work.
The archive I chose to work with was called The Artists' Lives. It's a project set up by the British Library, and for many years they've been conducting really extensive interviews with artists, getting them to talk about their whole sort of life, as it were. The archive was really amazing, and I spent many weeks listening to many interviews. And what was powerful for me was I let it infiltrate my life. As I was reading and thinking, I kept having this notion of apparatus, contraption. I'm slightly hesitant to make an artwork thing anyway, but particularly because I'm very wonderfully asked to think about thinking and how it relates to my work. And I kept thinking of the idea of a contraption and a device. At the same time, I was thinking very much of the experience of listening to the archive in my studio, in my home, and wanting to deliberately somehow bring the private into the piece of work. And that's where the notion of the drawers came in, and this notion of furniture. But a furniture less to put my jumpers in or for you to put your books in or something, but this sort of idea of the way that thinking, not thought and information, but the way thinking evolves around leading a life. And how there's something philosophically valuable about that. And at the same time, through my research on meteorites and this sort of worship, the argyolithy or something, where in very ancient times people would worship stone. So they already had culture. They actually made the most ornate contraptions to put the bare stone in. But the thing that was culturally significant, because it wasn't cultural, was the stone. So culture became a framing around this other thing. And suddenly you think this thing that might be part of our more rudimentary cultural past becomes for me innately sophisticated. And at that time I came across the quotation that's written through the drawers. And I found that quotation really powerful because it has a strange sculptural quality to it anyway. But it sort of looks to the idea of the imprint of the something else rather than the information that we know about things in the world. And that's why I knew I had to have that quotation. I wanted to let it live. I wanted to let it exist in our context today, as I knew it'd be anachronistic, but in a way I saw it as really relevant. But I knew it had to be not hidden, but that it had to belong to the work. So the drawers were a way of holding it and caretaking that. But also quite deliberately, I like the fact that if you're curious, you'll open those goddamn drawers. And if you want to invest your labour, you might string the sentence together. And if you don't, then that's fine. So the drawers and the statement sort of became the beginning cells of the work. And then because I've been thinking about apparatus and this idea of working towards something, artwork as a wonderful form and thing in itself, but as something that allowed form in life and productive form in thinking to happen, the scaffold became a relevant thing. And then of course it houses something. And then I put microphones at the very, very top. And the whole idea of burning to speak was linked to the meteorite, the fact that this form, this phenomenal thing in our world comes from elsewhere. This sense that just like those artists I listen to and which I revere them so much, hoping that my own ability to have that happen, which is both my labour and of me, but also of something else, wanting that to happen, and I'm really not sure how that happens. And certainly probably not by me speaking to you or writing something. So that's why that whole title was quite important, and I didn't want to explain it, although I think the piece of writing I wrote sort of becomes part of that contraption.
My piece was a sculpture called Swimming Machines, and there's actually two pieces in the exhibition. The piece I made was a large-scale sculpture of an actual swimming machine. It was made in collaboration with Joe Hancock. One of the things we wanted to do was make the machine itself look like it could be made by someone in their garage. So it's actually made from a lot of fitness equipment and found pieces of wood, so it does look quite DIY. The origins of this come from work that I did looking at an archive, which is Google Patents. Now, Google Patents contains patents dating all the way back to 1790. And what I was interested in doing is looking at patents, so it's objects and machines that people have designed related to swimming. I was really interested to find that there was lots and lots of things designed from the 1870s onwards. And I think this was mainly because in 1875, Captain Matthew Webb did the first channel swim, and in the UK, swimming was really taking off. So from that point onwards, what you find in Google Patents archive is lots of really fantastical devices that were designed by inventors with the idea of making swimming easier to learn. And one of the machines that we based our design on, me and Joe, was a particularly fantastic idea of a machine that would be land-based, so you wouldn't actually go in water to learn to swim, and it would help you learn to swim breaststroke. So we looked at that original patent and adapted that in various ways, and we came up with a sculpture in the exhibition. Alongside that was an outfit that was also made with a costume designer, and this was quite interesting because it's based on webbed parts of fishes. And the idea of this costume, dating back to around the same time, was that if you had webbed parts of an outfit that you would wear to swim, it would actually make it easier to swim in. And ironically, again, it's quite difficult to move your arms if you're wearing an outfit that's actually got webbed underarm sections. The other work alongside this is a series of collages called Swimming Machines. And those collages are collages that I made from different parts of machinery. And they look visually like the patents that you see in Google Patents archive, but they're quite fictional and very impossible to make. The parts for these collages come from military things such as helicopters, warships, planes, and they're put together to make the viewer believe really that these are real machines that could move through water. And there's 70 of these swimming machine archives.
Bernard and Hiller Beecher's photographs of the pit heads really drew my attention for the sense of repetition. Repetition not just as the repeated image and form such as they were utilising, but also repetition within the process of production. And I recently, well, about 5 years ago, I moved from London, central London, to a little place called Marsden, which is up on the Pennines in West Yorkshire. And it has great resonance with the Beecher's work, because within the centre of the village and on the outskirts, there are these old mills, these monoliths to manufacture, to Fordism, to the Industrial Revolution. So this idea of this industrial past that the Beechers so cleverly reproduced in their work over many, many years, a lifetime of work, was also evident here somehow. And I became very interested in this idea between the repeated image and the singularity of those objects that they were so lovingly reproducing in this very, very strict way. So walking through the landscape such as this is something that I do daily with my dog. And it's so different to London life. There are cultural things lost, cultural things gained, taking that leap. But as a person individually, I was very much operating out of my known context. And I really thought about how I might talk about this for the show and in relationship to the Beecher's images of those singular objects that were so much part of the landscape in the 19th century. And I've done this through the metaphor of a stone. I just felt this great affinity of these stones, and looking at the kind of way that they so beautifully fitted within their landscape made it quite a compelling object, an object that might be able to teach me something about how to live in somewhere such as Marsden. And I collected 100 of them. I'm very interested in process and system, and the process and system of collecting these objects, numbering them one by one until I reached 100. I was collecting these stones and in some way changing them, severing them from the context in which they existed, very much as I was feeling severed from the context in which I'd lived for 20 years. So I took them back to the studio, maintained that number, the number system in which they were gathered from the bottom of the river. So they became, rather than just objects in the bottom of the river, they had a numerical hierarchy. Alongside that, I started to photograph them in natural light, and I used a tape measure. Measuring the stones in this way really drew for me parallels between Staten Island and the way people who were migrating into America were taken, they were photographed, they were numbered. This was something that I seemed to be doing to these stones, and I really formed the first of 3 archives with these stones. The next archive I took a little bit further, and I started to link it with memories of living in London. So when I left London, nail bars were everywhere. So I thought about this as perhaps a process of change, a process of changing these very natural objects taken from their environment and masking them with nail varnish. So now they have a new hierarchy, they have a new community in which to exist. And I took the stones, the original stones, which of course now are this gaudy colour, and I put them back, I sort of returned them to the ground in a perspex box. So they adhered to this idea of art. So in this journey, I felt that the stones were really sort of taking into city life, they were taking into the art world. And in a similar way, I was travelling the other way, through into Marsden, into this idea of nature